evening, ladies and gentlemen, Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members and guests. It's my pleasure tonight to welcome Jim Ring. We're very lucky to have him talk to us tonight at the Club Night talk about the enigmatic character Erskine Childers. And he has written a biography of Erskine Childers in 1996, and we look forward to hearing more about his life. Thank you very much indeed.
Barry, thank you for that introduction, and ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming, and let me warn you, or let me draw to your attention the fact that I am the only person standing between you and your dinner. So, I will try and keep my remarks to 40 minutes, 45 minutes, at the end of which I'm very happy to take questions, and indeed over dinner to take questions. But I should say within those 45 minutes, here is this character who Barry has described as enigmatic, a very good word, I think, for a complicated figure. There are one or two people in the public domain who these days seem pretty straightforward, if not two-dimensional. This man was a multi-dimensional figure, and I cannot, and I'm sure you must not expect me to do complete justice to this figure in 45 minutes. All I can do is to give you a little thumbnail. And so multifaceted was this figure that when I set out to write this book, I started researching it in 1993 and completed the book for publication in 1996. I thought there were 4 or 5 separate books and separate ways of looking at this extraordinary and complex man. So this is a warning. It's a health warning. I will not, I'm afraid, be able in the course of this talk to answer all the questions I think you may wish to ask. But at least I hope it will give you a flavour of someone who I think was a very remarkable man. So, to begin, oh yes, this is, unless you think that this is for other purposes, I'm not feeling well. This is to keep me within bounds of the camera. So that's what that's for. Childers was born in 1870 and died. He was shot at dawn in 1922, so just over a century ago. That makes the story of Erskine Childers a topical one. So too to the celebrations last month for 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement. 1922, he died. Born 1870, and interestingly, that makes him a year younger than Mahatma Gandhi and 4 years older than his close contemporary, Winston Churchill. Both of those figures are important reference points for Erskine Childers. Right, to get into this story, how are we going to get into this story? How are we going to get into that story? I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to do what everyone does at interview. I'm going to give you a CV. So let's go into a quick CV of Erskine Childers. Now, this is very cleverly designed, this slide. You won't be able to read it, so you will have to listen to what I say. So, 1870, he was born, and this says it all, as will become apparent, born to an English father, but an Irish mother. And that dual allegiance, that dual loyalty, or that divided loyalty, runs through his life like colour through a stick of chalk. Orphaned and domiciled in Ireland in 1882, a tragedy that affected him throughout his life. His father, the Orientalist Robert Caesar Childers, picked up TV very shortly after his second son was born. And died of it when Erskine Childers, Robert Erskine Childers was his full name, was 6. His mother had nursed his father through this illness and was then consigned, when Childers was 6, to a home for what was then called incurables. He died at the age of 12 as a consequence of these and other experiences, but principally from that experience, he found it very difficult to hold on to the Christian Protestant faith in which he was brought up. He went to live in Ireland. He was fortunate in that respect with his mother's sister at a wonderful estate, Anglo-Irish ascendancy, the Protestant ruling classes of Ireland at that time, at Glendalough, which is about 30 miles south of Dublin in the county of Wicklow. And he had, insofar as it may be qualified by his parents' death, a happy childhood or later childhood there. He was sent to school in England, as you would expect, and he was sent to Haileybury. Then, and we'll be coming back to this, at the height of empire, Haileybury was devoted to the education of young gentlemen who would rule the empire. We'll be coming back to that. He was a bright, industrious boy who went to Trinity College, Cambridge, where he studied law and classics, and he did very well there. In the civil service exams of 1893, he came fourth in the whole country, and that enabled him to get one of the plum jobs in the civil service at that time, and that was as clerk to the House of Commons. He picked up that job, started that job in 1894, and finished it in 1910, withdrew from that in 1910. Clerk to the House of Commons, for those who don't know, and I can tell you, I certainly didn't know, is a very misleading term. You think of a Dickensian figure scribbling away. It's not like that at all. The clerks of the House of Commons who are the people who actually run the place, administer the place, and keep things going, drafting bills and so on and so forth. As we know from our recent experiences, politicians of many colours aren't really up to running things per se. So an important job. In 1900, he fights in the Boer War, which had brought the Second Boer War, strictly speaking, which had broken out the previous year. And 1903, we all know this, everyone in this room knows this, he publishes the most important book ever written, The Riddle of the Sands. And I was very, very disappointed to hear that in that library behind you, I inquired of the librarian today, there is only one copy of The Riddle of the Sands, only one, in my own much smaller library. Kate will tell me, my wife will tell me, there are at least 5. And she's always annoyed when she comes across another copy. 1904, by far the most important emotional event of his life, his marriage to an American, Molly, always known as Molly, Mary Alden Osgood. 1914, he masterminds the Hoth gun running, which was the beginning of what you might call his revolutionary period, more anon. 1914 too, only a month after the Hoth gun running that marked him out as an anti-establishment renegade and revolutionary. Well, blow me down if he doesn't join the Royal Navy. Who would have thought it? 1919, he moves to Dublin to fight for the cause of Irish independence. 1920 to 1921, masterminds anti-British propaganda and was jointly responsible with Michael Collins in bringing the British to the negotiating table. 1922, in the course of the Civil War, he was executed by the nascent Free State. All this will become apparent. But that's the CV. And I think that in itself, that's quite an interesting CV. You know, if you were faced with that, missed the last point, you might think, yeah, quite an interesting chap, probably worth interviewing for certain sorts of job. So the riddle, really, of Erskine Childers, the riddle for obvious reasons, and this is him on his way to the Boer War, or in the Boer War. How and why did this revered author end up getting shot at dawn 100 years ago? Authors do many things. Few of them get shot. Few of them are men of action. Hemingway is perhaps one of the most obvious exceptions, but authors on the whole are men of intellect and industry and not men of action, or not. So let's talk a little bit about empire, because Childers' story is incomprehensible without the notion of empire. Just as a reminder, 320 million people were ruled by Queen Victoria in the last quarter of the 19th century, when the British Empire was, in practical terms, at its height. For geophysical reasons, it was the empire. It was the empire on which the sun never sets. And even the French, of course, even the French, on the occasion of the Queen's, Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, declared that the empire at that time was the greatest the world had ever known. Even the French said that. Think of that. And Erskine Childers is an undergraduate, and his story is that of a trajectory from imperialism to republicanism. That is the essence of the story that I'm going to tell. Said as an undergraduate, one can set no limit. One can set no limit to the possibilities of an alliance of the English-speaking races. Think of that. Think of that, but think too of others, such as Gandhi. Gandhi, born in 1869, and therefore a young lawyer at the time of the publication of the Wimper Sands. Mahatma Gandhi, the author of Indian nationalism, be the change that you wish to see in the world. I'm not going to review the rights and wrongs of empire. I'm simply, this isn't the time or the place, I'm simply saying that without this understanding and context, Childers' story is incomprehensible. More readily, for you, I'm sure this evening, and for me in many respects, Childers was, of course, and this was a key aspect to his personality and a key aspect, a key skill that he brought to his life story, and it was life-changing, was Childers the Corinthian sailor. And we all remember, I'm sure, that wonderful scene, more or less at the beginning of the Wimper Sands, when Carruthers goes out and meets Arthur Davis, and Arthur Davis is there with that little bandaged hand, and it's rather late at night when Carruthers has come in, and Carruthers is aghast to discover the smallness of the boat and the fact that he is going to be the crew. Horror of all horrors. Corinthian sailors, the wealthy amateurs who sailed themselves, a different story, and Childers was one of the pioneers. Very interestingly, Childers' own remarks and journalism on the strange development of him as a sailor. For many of us, we sailed with our parents and we became children, we became sailors as a function of that. Not Childers, no history of sailing in the family. There's a wonderful passage in one of his collection of journalism put together by Hugh and Diana Popham, in which he says something like, at some stage in our early 20s, my brother Henry and I took to the water like demented ducks. Suddenly, they got this huge enthusiasm and very soon developed very considerable skill as sailor. In 1893, just before he went into his job of the clerk of the House of Commons, he bought the 35-foot cutter Schuyler. This was, remember the wonderful Maurice Griffiths stories about selling people inappropriate boats. Schuyler was not a suitable boat for amateurs. I think she drew something like 8 or 9 feet. Robert Erskine Childers and his brother Henry sailed around the south coast of England and discovered, not very surprisingly, with that sort of drawing that sort of with that sort of depth draft. Thank you. She was not very suitable for a number of the drying harbours. So in 1895, he sold Schuyler and bought Marguerite. And Marguerite set him on the trail of Asgard, of Vixen, of Dulcibella, and ultimately to his execution. Half-decker Marguerite, 18-footer, so just a couple of feet bigger than a Wayfarer. And in that boat, he went on a wonderful cruise, detailed there, from Greenhithe to Cherbourg, 462 nautical miles. And for this, he won the Admiral de Horsey Cup. And that recognition and imagine that feat of seamanship 125 years ago, slightly more than that. Think of that in the circumstances of sailing then, without proper lighting, without proper weather forecasting, without all the safety aids that these days we take for granted. Quite an achievement that was recognised, and my old friend Morgan Drummond, the late Morgan Drummond, with whom I organised the 2003, I should say, celebrations for the centenary of the publication of the River Sands on Norderney, reckons that this was the turning point of Erskine, that public recognition of his skills as a sailor, and particularly often as a single-handed sailor. 1897, he bought the converted lifeboat Vixen, and Vixen, as I'm sure many of you know, was the model for the Dulcibella in the River Sands. Interestingly, we can go into this another time, not a precise model, and the differences are explored by Maldron in his lovely book, The Riddle. Some very interesting differences for those with technical interests in those. Any people here, I'm sure, between the two. And he took Vixen on an epic 4-month voyage to the Frisians. And of course, it was that voyage that planted the seed for the River Sands. And if you care to look carefully at the logbook of that voyage, and if you care to look very carefully at the River Sands itself, you will find that there are many passages where Childers is lifting from the logbook word for word, particularly in that wonderful passage that describes the approach to Bensersiel in those very rough waters, and the description that I think the people on the shore thought we had dropped from the we had dropped from the heavens with, I thought, an undercurrent of disappointment. There was no salvage work to be had. So the inspiration of the River Sands. So pushing on, let's go on to the Boer War and let's go on to imperialism. The Boer War of the time, breaking out, Second Boer War, 1899, the great imperial cause of Childers' youth. He was 30 at the time it broke out, 29. And again, you will know, Cape Colony, under British rule, the squabble was between them and the Boer republics to the north, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Was it about autonomy? Was it about independence? Was it about self-determination? It was about all those things. But it was also about gold. Gold! It was also about gold, and it was about all the gold discovered not very deep in what is now Johannesburg. It was a squabble about money. Above all, a squabble about money. Childers joined the ranks despite his spectacles and sciatica, and I should emphasise the ranks. He didn't go out as an officer, and he wrote to his sister Dulcibella, "Don't you think it would be splendid to do something for one's country, and think of this in the historical context of the rise of nationalism and the very recent foundation as a function of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, the new formation of that state of Germany, hitherto a collection of principalities." Childers' action as gunner, he wrote some charming letters home to his sisters, whom he kept constantly entertained with his exploits, doubtless filtering out the less desirable aspects of his experience. They're very witty, they're very engaging, they're exquisitely written. You see there the scenes of the Saar that you see in the River Sands, very particular, very detailed, and a lovely sense of humour. And those letters home were published, and this was a fairy tale that awaits every aspirant author. There on the ship, waiting on the dockside on his return from the Boer War, was the publisher saying, "I shall publish your letters home as in the ranks of the City Imperial Volunteers," the CIV. Now that was a wonderful thing that started to establish Childers as an author, and if the Voyage in Marguerite established his own identity in his own head as a very, very, very good sailor, this too began to open his eyes to the notion that he might also be a very, very, very good writer. Very interesting, though, also, and here you see this rather wonderful picture of John Bull tied down by the machinations of the Boers, the experience in the Transvaal, the experience fighting against the Boers planted also the seeds of his later republicanism, because he saw with what determination and imagination the Boers, particularly using guerrilla tactics, commando tactics later employed in Ireland, he came to admire those people as well as to fight against them. So then the favourite book, I can skip over this slide, can't I? Because you know all about it. A record of Secret Service recently achieved. A thriller about the discovery of a German plot to invade. Well, we know all that. The more interesting thing is that post-1870, post the establishment of Germany and the growth of Germany, and in Childers' terms, in particular, the German naval laws and the establishment by the Kaiser of the High Seas Fleet as a function of the naval laws of 1896, and Tirpitz and all that story with which you'll be familiar, they developed what literary historians call a genre of invasion literature. And between 1870 and 1914, they published no fewer than 400 books, all fitting, roughly speaking, into that category. And the fascinating thing about Childers' book, which has a very similar theme in many respects to the rest of the invasion literature, as you would expect from the name, with the interesting exception of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, which used a metaphor for invasion, or German invasion. Erskine Childers, The Will of the Sands, is the only one still read. So there is something evergreen about The Will of the Sands, which means that it's never been out of print. And when I was working on this in 1993, first working on this in 1993, there were 13 separate editions of The Will of the Sands still in print. And I don't think that number is very, very different today. The book is also acknowledged as a precursor, an acknowledged precursor to people like Frederick Forsyth, Graham Greene, John le Carré, who acknowledged the influence of Childers in their work. It was, very interestingly, highly influential with the Admiralty in pointing people moving from there, looking south to the French as the old enemy, to looking there, to looking east to Germany, the threat of Germany, in precisely the way, not precisely the way, in an analogous way. Suddenly people here, or perhaps people down there in Westminster, are beginning to wake up to the threat of China. Yes, people were thinking, old habits died hard, and they needed to start thinking about the threat of Germany, not just the threat of France, which was about the invasion, what the invasion literature was all about. Arguably, and someone will argue here, I'm sure, the best book about small boats sailing in Britain, and as a foretaste of the remainder of Childers' story, it concerns the part played by the individual in great affairs of state. We'll be coming back to that. Very important to his life's development and the sense of his own identity, The Will of the Sands. It was not precisely a bestseller, but it made him an established name amongst the great and good, the circles in which he lived. As a consequence of going to the Boer War, there was an event arranged by the Honourable Artillery Company, of which the City Imperial Volunteers, in which Childers served, was a part, or was a subset. Off goes the Honourable Artillery Company to Boston to visit its counterpart there in the autumn of 1903, so 5 months after the publication of The Will of the Sands, which had, in certain circles, already made Childers known. Here he meets this very, very, very attractive, self-confident, highly intelligent American called Mary Alton Osgood. The family dates from, there are family connections linked to the founding fathers. She was crippled in 1878 in a skating accident and never walked without the assistance of sticks and other forms of support. It was a whirlwind romance, and they were married in the January of 1904. Childers was out there for 3 weeks. He knew it was now or never. He proposed more or less on the last day of his visit, and the rest is history. It was a wonderful, wonderful marriage. They were, as I said, they're twin souls, and if I was writing the book today, I would undoubtedly call the book Erskine Childers, or would I, Barry? I didn't think I would. I think I would be castigated for that, wouldn't I? I would have to call it Molly and Erskine Childers. So, great marriage, very important to Childers' life. And critically, firm Republican, well, where was she born and brought up? Boston Tea Party and so on and so forth. And an adherent of the great cause of the day, which was that of Irish nationalism. Now, the Irish question, here I'm merely rehearsing, I don't doubt, what you know already, and here is a rather lovely cartoon. John Bull here, Ulster here, Ulster's prayer, don't let go. Well, of course, that might be a contemporary. There might be something entirely contemporary about that. Might not. Ireland ruled from Westminster, as we know, since 1801. Long tradition of Irish rebellion, because the Irish didn't fancy being ruled by the British, particularly the Irish in the south, predominantly Catholic, didn't particularly relish being ruled from Westminster by an essentially Protestant group of people. The Great Famine of 1845 to 49 exacerbated their discontent as well it might, because of the gross neglect of the poor of Ireland during that famine by the government in Westminster, and is a watershed in Irish history. As a function of that, in the last quarter of the 19th century, there was a major movement for what was then called Home Rule in Ireland, which was, as you might suppose, a form of autonomy or quasi-autonomy, devolution as we would call it today. The movement for Home Rule. Childers was, by background, against such suggestions of giving freedom to the Irish, was an imperialist. But he transits on the trajectory from unionism to Home Rule from 1903 to 1914 as a consequence of 3 things. The influence of his wife, 1. 2, the experience of travelling in Ireland, which he did extensively in the years after his marriage. He always spent some time at Glendalough, and he toured the south extensively and was familiar with the circumstances of the Irish working classes in that area. And thirdly, because of the strong political movement that he witnessed down the road for Home Rule in Westminster, because it was the question of the day in the same way that Brexit has been over the last, 10 years. Not everyone thought this was a good idea, particularly in the north, the largely Protestant north. And in 1912, in the autumn of 1912, the Ulster Covenant was signed by something like 500,000 people, which is a considerably smaller population than today. That's quite a lot. And these people set their faces against Home Rule because they called it, and you will remember the phrase, and as a former ad man, I love the slogan, and the slogan is, of course, Home Rule. Who can complete this? Home Rule is Rome Rule. Home Rule is Rome Rule. Home Rule, if you lived in Belfast, was something to do with being ruled from down there, from Dublin. So there was this great schism in Ireland. And there you have the Ulster Covenant signed in the autumn of 1912. In the following 18 months, as we build up to other events on the continent and elsewhere, this came very nicely to the boil, with, on the one hand, people very keen, particularly on the south, on devolution, and on the other, very keen on maintaining the link with the Union. And in April 1914, those in the north ran some guns into the Belfast port of Larne, 25,000 guns, quite a few, into just north of Belfast. And the purposes of that was to arm the Ulster Volunteers, to create a paramilitary group to resist the imposition of Home Rule. Erskine Childers and Molly and Erskine, there in that order, were very upset by this, as were a number of Irish and Anglo-Irish supporters of Home Rule. And they said, right, we'll do the same, we'll follow suit. And the way in which they did so was interesting. Childers was one of the leading forces within it. He made a significant financial contribution to buying guns. He actually went to get the guns, disguised as a Mexican revolutionary from the continent. And many of the guns he bought were previously used in the Franco-Prussian War. So they were quite old, and there weren't very many of them. There were 1,500. Okay? So by the comparison with 25,000 shipped into Larne, it was token. It was relatively token. And that's rather exemplified by that very interesting picture. What's going on there? First of all, it's on Asgard, because Childers decided he would use Asgard to run the guns, his wedding present into Ireland, picking them up, and this is a wonderful story in its own right, transshipping them at sea from a tug just off Zeebrugge, and running them all the way in through very heavy storms and past the British fleet to the Dublin port of Howth. But look at that picture. Looks posed, doesn't it? And it does look posed because it was posed, and it was posed for publicity purposes. That's Molly on the right, and that is someone called Mary Sprigg Rice. Again, an Anglo-Irish ascendancy family on the right. And it's posed. And why, in the year of 1914, I wonder, would they both be women? But why would there be no men in that picture? Well, I can't think. I can't think at all. So that's quite interesting. The guns were used to run, the Asgard was used to run guns into Howth on the 26th of June 1914. And critically, even though that number looks small, they led and they were used in the Easter Rising. I'll come back to that in a second. We're getting on now, not long between now and supper. The Great War. I could write a book about this in itself. Childers' role in the Great War. I won't impose this on you now, but I cannot tell Childers' story without a summary. Childers could have avoided volunteering. Many people well over age, of course, volunteered to fight in the First World War. That great expression of nationalism, both in Germany and in Great Britain, and indeed in France. He volunteered at the age of 44. Eddie Marsh, Churchill's private secretary, pointed to Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, and said, we need this man, because, surprise, surprise, no man knows the German coast, the northern German coast, better than Erskine Childers. No-brainer, isn't it? He served in the early aircraft carriers, very early aircraft carriers, and was the aerial navigator for the Cuxhaven raid. Cuxhaven raid took place, surprise, surprise, Cuxhaven, Christmas Day 1914. It is of historical significance because it is the very first example of combined operations, air, surface ships, and quite early submarines. Quite important in that sense. Went to Gallipoli. He was a pioneer there of both aerial navigation and photography, aerial photography. He returned to England and pioneered, with one or two others, the coastal MTBs, and those of us who are interested in this, and this is perhaps in this room, the very early MTBs had a torpedo. You started the engine on the torpedo, you pushed it off the back, and you then attempted to outrun the torpedo. And they are building one of these, or rebuilding one of these at Chatham at the moment, or Chatham when I was last there. And I have seen, I think at Chatham, some absolutely wonderful footage, and I can tell you it makes you think twice, pushing the torpedo off the back of that, and thinking that or hoping that you would outpace your torpedo. So quite interesting, and he was very important in his navigational work in successfully raiding these, and of course the MTBs recall some of the ideas in The Ring of the Sands about the value of mosquito boats and their power in how effective they might be against the monstrous dreadnoughts. Very little expenditure on the mosquitoes, very little expenditure on the MTBs to sink a 25,000-ton battleship, the pride of the seas. He was posted to Norfolk in 1918, and he set to raid Berlin in a 4-engine bomber, set for the 11th of the 11th of 1918. That may remind you something. And he left, he was demobbed in the rank of major. He was decorated DSC. Fascinating war in its own right. So we're now going back 2 years, and we're working towards the conclusion and your supper. Easter Rising was, again, you will know all this, armed insurrection in Dublin, and it was the occasion on which an Irish Republic was declared, and the little description of this, the Declaration of Independence, was posted on the post office, was set up in the post office in central Dublin. 6 days of insurrection, hundreds were dead, the rising was suppressed, and it was put down, this uprising was put down with peculiar ferocity. With the British, you might think they had some excuse in 1916 to put this down with great ferocity. We needn't go there, but it was put down with great ferocity. The only one of the ringleaders spared was someone who will figure in the remainder of this story, Eamon de Valera, who became the political head, of course, of the IRA, and he was forgiven or let off because he was half American. So, this was the beginning of the movement that led to Irish independence. This lit the fuse, and its significance was lay in the fact that it would not have been possible. Not possible without the guns run into Howth by Childers. And just a tiny little fact. So the Ascot's freeboard was down to about 2 feet when she was loaded with all these ammunition, and they were jammed. And when she came to be restored in 2006, 2007, and she's beautifully restored, it can be seen in the Michael Collins Barracks now in Dublin, they found 2 rifles jammed up again underneath the boards. So, the end of the story. Now, here we have Versailles, and we're here critically in terms of Childers' political development and ideas. We have Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States on the right. The kingmaker, you might say, the chap whose forces had turned the course of the war in 1917 and principally in 1918 itself. His ideas, embedded in the 14 points of self-determination and the freedom of countries and nations to choose their own leadership, sod empire, you might say, to use a colloquial expression. And Childers set great store on this. He felt that the war had been fought, as some others did, about the freedom of another small nation from Germany, and that small nation was Belgium. The scrap of paper, He felt that this was a story about self-determination. He worked for the cause, the propaganda cause of Irish independence, under de Valera's guidance, when de Valera got out of Lincoln jail. And he was hugely disappointed at the outcome of Versailles, which gave no comfort at all to those seeking the independence of Ireland, Home Rule having been shelved for the latter during hostilities, as you might suppose. So that leads us, once the war is over, to the consequences of the Easter Rising, which is the War of Independence in Ireland between January 1919 and July 1921. It was a guerrilla war between the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, the re-expression of the Ulster Volunteers, and the British Army. Again, you will probably know all about this, but it's about the auxiliaries, the Auxes as they were nicknamed, and because of their uniforms, the black and tans. They were very ill-disciplined. They were very badly behaved. The Irish were equally badly behaved. There were gross atrocities on both sides. About 2,000 people were died in the course of the War of Independence, and the military leadership on the part of the IRA was, of course, again, you know this, Michael Collins. The propaganda leadership was Erskine Childers. And if you can single down the decision by the British in the summer of 1901 to come to the negotiating table, then it can be put down to those two people. Military Collins, using the guerrilla warfare and the techniques learned much from the Boers, and the propaganda genius of Childers. And it's always said that Childers, leaving aside, one, his press contacts that he had developed at Versailles, two, his ability as a writer, long established, but three, critically, his understanding of the psychology of quote-unquote the enemy made him a propagandist in the very early days of the notion of propaganda of peculiar gifts. The very first director of propaganda was, in this country, was his very old friend and publisher in the course of the war, and his name was John Buchan. He was the very first director of information. And we'll come on to John Buchan in the final slide, and we're about 5 minutes from your supper. Propaganda masterminded by Childers, military masterminded by Michael Collins. That led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921, and it led to Dominion status for Ireland, the creation of what was called the Irish Free State, and it led to partition. We all know about partition because it exists today, as in the partition between the northern counties, basically Ulster, and the southern counties, basically the Catholic South. We all know about that. The chief thing about that is that it was a partial victory for the Republicans. It was not a complete one. And it led to the schism. It led to the Irish Civil War from June 1922 to May 1923 between those who accepted the treaty, who bizarrely, strangely, paradoxically enough, were led by Michael Collins, regarded by Lloyd George and the other people, Lloyd George then Prime Minister, and the other people who negotiated that treaty that I have mentioned, including Churchill, back in the government after the Gallipoli disaster. Collins regarded as the brightest, most flexible, the most imaginative of those who negotiated the treaty on the Irish side. Childers was not a delegate, he was the secretary to that delegation. And Émile de Valera, and again we won't go into this, but he's significant, Émile de Valera, the political head, chose not to go to the negotiations. He repudiated the treaty in a very big meeting in the Irish Parliament, the Dáil, and then the Civil War breaks out between what we call Free Staters and the Republicans. Okay, so the Free Staters were led by Michael Collins, and the Republicans were led by Émile de Valera, supported by Childers. Childers had no military role, but again was propaganda chief. And in due course, May 1923, Republicans were crushed. And the Irish Free State went on for many years, as you all know, under Émile de Valera. So, two final slides, and then a few questions, and then supper. Childers' execution. Childers was captured by Free State, Irish Free State forces on the 10th of November 1922. He was captured, he was betrayed by someone on the domestic staff at Glendalough, where he'd fled for sanctuary. And he was probably dying at that stage by the disease that killed his parents, TB. He was in possession of a pistol given to him in happier days by Michael Collins, a small Spanish pistol, and at that time the Irish Free State had declared that the carrying of arms was a capital offence. He was executed by a firing squad on the 24th of November 1922, despite international appeals for mercy, and he insisted that his eldest son should go round and forgive a half dozen, 12 people responsible for his death, politicians. It was, in effect, what is normally described as judicial murder. And very famously, you may remember that on the occasion of his execution at dawn, on that day, facing the firing squad, he turned away the chance to wear a blindfold. And he said to the firing squad, having first shaken hands with all of them, he said, "Come a step closer, lads. Come a step closer, lads. It will be easier that way." Some estimates of Erskine Childers. I love John Buchan's. No revolution ever produced a nobler or a purer spirit. Winston Churchill, who said some quite nasty things about Childers in the course of his life. There's one great quote in the course of the negotiations when he said, Churchill said, accused me of trying to start one war with the River Sands and another with his current activity. A great patriot and statesman with whom, however, I have disagreed on everything. Churchill. Eamon de Valera, his boss, close confidant, very good friend, a prince among men, and Geoffrey Household, who many of the people here will probably remember from writing that wonderful novel, thriller, Rogue Mail, in the introduction to one of the Penguin editions of Erskine Childers' The Sands, he wrote, and I think we can all agree with this, he wrote only one novel, and that is immortal. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much. This is being recorded, so please, if you have any questions, do speak up so that they can be heard. We have a few minutes now for questions, before drinks, charging your glasses and then dinner. We have some military people here, we have historians here. I'm sure that would have raised some interesting notes. Any questions?
If you have no questions, I'm very happy to take them on.
I have one.
Here we have.
How is Childers regarded in Ireland today?
Very interesting question indeed. I was saying to Barry, when I first started research on this book a long time ago in 1993, I went over to Ireland. Most of his papers in Trinity College, Dublin, and I talked to taxi drivers, friends, and so on and so forth about what I was doing. And they said, "Oh yes, Erskine Childers. Which one? Which one?" Because there were two, and the second was the son who forgave his father's executioners, or at least murderers, quote unquote. And he became president of Ireland and died in office in 1974. And secondly, when you talk to them, talk to the Irish, as a generality, about Erskine Childers, the last thing they mention and know about is the River Sands. They see him as one of the fathers of modern Ireland, but there is a famous remark by the politician and one of the fellow treaty delegate members of the delegation that produced the treaty, Arthur Griffith, who called Childers a damned Englishman. And that ambiguity about his position persists to this day. When he joined the Navy, he received a telegram from the Admiralty Intelligence Section in London, which came to the IRA headquarters in Dublin. And that led to the notion that he was an English spy, and elements of such beliefs still exist. So Childers, on a positive note, is regarded by many alongside Collins as one of the fathers of modern Ireland. He's never really been forgiven, though, for being half English. That probably summarise.
I should say that spur for this talk is the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which 25 years, it seems, only yesterday, it's a long time ago, really, isn't it? But it's that which was prompted this talk tonight, and I want to thank you very much indeed for such an interesting talk. There will be dinner, and afterwards, if anybody has any further questions, Jim has very kindly offered to answer.
We'll be around at about sometime
after supper and around afterwards. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.